Today's daf is daf Chof Vav, and just to uh, review what we did at the end of Chafayim and Beis, we were talking about a case where the animal was inside the Azara, which is the place it has to be for Shechita, but part of its body, let's say the legs, were outside of the Azara. And apparently, if let's say he can somehow cut off the legs before he shechts the animal, that would be okay. Although the Gemara is going to object, that makes it into a treifa. But before we get to that question, because then from the time of the first avot of shechita, there's no problem with the legs of the animal being outside the azor. But if first he shechts the animal before he removes the legs of the animal, then the dam in the legs of the animal, insofar as they're yotze, there's a psul called yotze, which invalidates any part of the animal for a carbon. And now the dam of the leg is yotze, it's possible, and therefore it mixes through the circulatory system with the dam in the rest of the body, which is kosher, which is not yotze, that's in the azara. So the Gemara says on the top of Daf Chavov, Shochat v'yachkach chotach psula, right? Because at the time of the shechita, there was dam coming in from the legs that were possible, that was possible the yotze, mixing with the dam in the rest of the body. But chotach v'yachkach shochat ksher, so the Gemara asks, Valmum kol makriv, is it possible that he cuts off the legs of the animal before the shechita? Then it's certainly a balmum and it's possible. Ela ema chotach v'yachkach kibel ksher. What happens is after he does the shechita, but before he does the Kabbalah Saddam, so in that very short Pesach Zman, in that case, since at the time of the Kabbalah Saddam, there was no dam that was yotze because he had already severed the legs, then the carbon is kosher. But kibel, the achgach chotach psula. But if he was makabel the dam, and at that point the legs of the animal were still outside the azar, and therefore the dam is possibly din yotze and mixes with the other dam, therefore it passes the carbon. Gemara says chotach v'yachkach kibel kshera. Even in the case where he shechted the animal and then subsequently severed the legs, and then he was makabel the dam, it also should be possible. Why? Based on a statement of Rab Zera, Omer Rab Zera, and this we had yesterday on Daf Chaf Hey, Hatzorim Ozun Buchar V'Yachkach Kibel Damo Posel. That if the carbon became a balmum between the shechita and the Kabbalah, then it's possible. Shenemar v'lokach, and the word v'lokach always refers to Kabbalah Saddam, midam hapar, parsha hayakfar. Omer Rav Chizda, Omer Avimi, chotech bi'ever ad shamagil li'etzem. Right, he should cut the that limb which is outside of the azara until he reaches the bone. He doesn't cut through the bone, and therefore the animal per se is still considered a tamim, and it's not a balas mum. So the psul of balmum would only apply when the bone is cut through. The circulation of the blood from the legs can be halted merely by cutting all the flesh in the arteries. Okay. Now, kibel v'yachkach chotach psula, right? If he was makabel dam, then he cuts off the legs, then the carbon is possible because the dam of Yotze, which is possible, now mixes together with the rest of the dam kosher. Shamet mino dam hamuvla bevorim damhu. So apparently there's a whole sugya with regard to dam that's muvla bevorim. In other words, it hasn't yet come forward. It's within the animal, and it's still considered dam. You might have argued that dam is only dam as a separate entity when it's outside the body. But here it's within the circulatory system, and it still is considered dam. And therefore, it became possible with Yotze. So Gemara says, no, maybe that's not so. Dilma mishum shamnunis. Maybe the psul here is not because of the dam, because the dam is muvla be'evorim, and that's not subject to the same dam in the psul of Yotze, but we have the problem of shamnunis, which are the fats of the body of the animal, and that's considered basar. And basar is possible biyotze if it's taken out of the azara. So that fat that's contained within the legs mingles with the blood, and since the fats which are basar are possible biyotze, by mingling with the dam, they passel the dam. Shamet mina basar kodshim kalim sheyotzel lifnei zrikas dam passel. Okay, now this is a big sugya in Zevachim that has to do with the status before Zrika. Now, there's a difference here between kodshim like chatas and oshim, and kodshim kalim like shlomim. And with regard to kodshim, then there's a psul of Yotze even before the Zrika Sadam. However, with regard to kodshim kalim, we don't know that that's the case. Is there psul of Yotze before Zrika? And the Gemara wants to derive from our discussion here about Ravami the conclusion that even in kodshim, assuming that we're talking about a shlomim, which we don't know for sure, but the Gemara is making that assumption, then the dam itself is possible biyotze. I'm sorry, the basar itself is possible biyotze even before the zrika sadam. So Gemara says dilma v'kodshim kam, kodshim. Ton rabbanan kodshim shchitasa batzafon. Right, there's a din of tzafon in the azara, and that's the area that's designated for shchita of kodshim. Kibul dam the klisharis batzafon, and likewise the dam has to be received in the tzafon, in a klisharis. But omad bidarom, bahoshit yodel at tzafon, v'shachat. What happens if he is standing on the southern side of the azara, and he stretches his hand out to the tzafon, and he does the shchita there? So the Bryce establishes that shchitasa ksheira, that it doesn't matter where he's standing. He happens to be standing, the Kohen or Oved, in the Daron, but it doesn't matter. Since he does the shchita in the tzafon, then it's kosher. However, kibel kabbalas psula. If he was standing in the Daron and he was mekabel adam, that kabbalah is possible. And this is based on a drasha in the Gemara later on Daf Mem Chesam and Beis, that on the one hand, kodshim have to be shechted in the tzafon of the azara, but he doesn't have to stand there because the Torah says v'shochat oso. Oso is referring to the animal. The oso has to be al yerech hamizbeach tzafon, on the north side, and it has to be on the side of the mizbeach. But that's only as far as the korban itself. But as far as the shochet, who's doing the shechita, then it doesn't matter. he could be standing in the Durham. However, that halacha that Safon in Kodesh Kodeshim only depends upon where the animal is located. But if the Kohen was outside the Tzafon, within the Azara, then it's kosher. That only applies, the Gemara establishes in that same sugi that we referred to on Daf Mem Tes, that it only applies to the Shechita, but not to Kabbalah, which means that not only in the case of Kabbalah Saddam, not only does the animal itself have to be in the Tzafon, but the Kohen likewise has to be located in the Tzafon. And the Gemara derives that from Psukim. And this would be another example of where we're a little bit more lenient, the Torah is more lenient with regard to Shechita than with regard to Kabbalah, because Shechita is Ksher Bizarre. Okay, fine. Hichnis Rosho Verubo Ki'ilu Nichnas Kulo. So with regard to that psul that we said applies to Kabbalah Saddam if the Kohen is outside of the Tzafon, if most of his body, that means his head and half of the body or more than half of the body is in the Tzafon, then it's kosher. And that's based on a principle called Rubo Kekulo, Haint is Sukkos. And, in Sukkos, there's also a halacha that if most of your body is inside the sukkah, you can be yotze the mitzvah of sukkah. Pirkesa v'yotze solidorom v'chazra kshera. So if he did the shechita in the tzafon as he was meant to do, but then the animal started shaking, that's called pirkus, convolutions, and it moved from the tzafon into the Durham, but then it was taken back into the tzafon, then it's kosher. Now, whether or not it has to be taken back into the tzafon, it seems, based on Rashi, that that's lav dafka. As long as the shechita was done in the tzafon in the north, it doesn't matter that the animal, through its convolutions, ends up in the south. That's irrelevant. I mean, the shechita was done, but this is only mentioned because of the seif, as we'll soon see. So all the above applies to kodshim like chatos, all and so forth, because there the Torah requires tzafon. However, kodshim kalim, like for example, shlomim, shchitasim bifnim, anywhere in the Azara is kosher. Kibul dom klishas bifnim, anywhere in the Azara is valid for the Kabbalah Saddam. Omad bachutz, v'hichnis yadu lifnim v'shachat, shchitasim kshera. However, let's say the animal is inside the Azara, but the Kohen is standing outside the Azara. Nevertheless, since he did the Shechita in the Azara, although, again, he's standing outside the Azara, it's kosher, but Kibel Kabbalah Psula, if he is standing outside the Azara and he's Mekabel Adam inside the Azara, but he is located outside the Azara, it's possible, as we said before, because we're more machmir with regard to Kabbalah than Shechita. Hichnis Rosha Veruba Ki'ulu Lo Nichnas. However, with regard to the Azara, the halach of Bias Migdash requires that the entire body of the Kohen, from top to bottom, from tip to toe, has to be inside the Azara. And again, we're going to have this a little bit later on today. This is derived from Psukim, that it says Bevam el Oel Moed, and Bevam means their entire body enters into the Oel Moed, into the Azara. Now we have other avodos that require Heichal, and there too he must enter into the Heichal, which is otherwise in the Mishkan it's called the Oel Moed. His entire body has to enter in. Pirkus of Yotza L'chutz V'chazra Psula. Now here, with regard to the Azara, if the animal, as a result of its convolutions, after the Shechita in the Azara jumps out of the Azara, it's possible. And the reason for that is because anything that leaves the Azara becomes possible with Yotze. Now, I think, if I'm not mistaken, what we're discussing here when it says psula is that the basar is possible. But I don't think the carbon itself is possible. So, but I think I'm right about this, but I don't see it here now. Okay, weiter. Shma mino. What do we derive from this? That besar kodshim kalam sheyotzel lifnei zrikas domim psulim. Remember, we had a discussion about whether the psul yotze applies before the zrika. Here, we see that we're talking about a case of Kabbalah, so it means it's before the zrika, and yet the psak here is crystal clear. It's possible. And why is it possible? Because Pirkus of Yotza went out of the Azor, and the Psul of Yotze applies even before Zrika. So the Gemara says, no. Dilma, perhaps be Aliyah v'yoseres hakoved ushtei kloyos. Right, what we're talking about is that those parts of the animal that require haktorah al gabi mizbeach, and the psul here is chal vis-a-vis haktorah. So the brisa doesn't mean that the basar and so forth is possible, but only those parts of the basar which are subject to haktar, right? The parts of the basar that are eaten by the zichrei kuna, and there are other parts of the basar that have to be burnt on the mizbeach. Those parts that have to be burnt on the mizbeach, even in the case of kodshim kalim, are considered like kodshe kodshim. They have the same status. And they become possible for haktorah al gabi mizbeach because they left the azara. However, the meat itself, the basar, which generates a mitzvah of achila, that could leave the azara, and you can eat it anywhere in Yerushalayim because we're talking about kodshim kalim. Kodshim kalim anechal l'chol adam, even a non-Kohen, and that applies anywhere in Yerushalayim. Okay, here we start the main sugya for today. And this is a list of, I think, 4 different questions that the father of Shmuel asked his son Shmuel. And unfortunately, in each case, at least according to the father of Shmuel, Shmuel got it wrong. The first question he asked his son was, He bifnim v'ragleh b'chutz ma'u. Let's say the carbon itself is inside the azara, but the raglayim are outside the azara. Amalei, so Shmuel responds to his father, Ksiv v'havim lashem, and that means that ad shetei kulo lifnim. That means that even the raglayim of the animal have to be inside the azara. Now, at this point, Avud Shmuel doesn't respond, so it would seem that he accepted Shmuel's diuk in the pasuk, and he asks him the second question: Tola v'shochet ma'u. Now, I'm not sure exactly how this works in physics, but somehow you can have a case where the animal is suspended in midair, and he shechts it. And is that considered like it's in the Azara when it's in the airspace of the Azara? Omalek Shera. So Shmuel responded yes, because Shmuel understood that the airspace of the Azara is equal to the Azara itself, Omalei. And now the father of Shmuel responds, Ishtabash, you made a mistake. Be'inad shchita al yerech v'leka. So apparently we're talking here about kodshe kodshim, which requires yerech, which means that the shechita has to be done on the side of the mizbeach, and you cannot consider it yerech hamizbeach if it's suspended in midair. So now Shmuel's father asks him, "V'nitla v'shachad ma'u." What happens? Not that the animal was suspended in midair, but the shochet was flying in the air, and he does the shechita amalei psula. It's got to be puzzle, meaning that not only does the animal have to be in the azara, but the shochet also has to be in the azara, and he's floating in midair. Amalei, and Shmuel's father responds to Shtabash, you made a mistake. Shchita al yerech, below shochet al yerech. The animal itself has to be on yerech hamizbeach, because that's what the Torah implies when it says also al yerech hamizbeach. But the shochet doesn't have to be al yerech. So the avud de Shmuel is mekil in this case where the shochet is suspended in midair over the azar and does the shechita against his son Shmuel. Another question: Nitla v'kibel mahu. What happens if the Kohen, instead of being suspended in midair when he does the shechita, he was suspended in midair when he did the Kabbalah? Yeah, I don't know. Don't ask me about the physics how this works exactly. And Amalek Shera and Shmuel, in this case, Shmuel was the Mekil. Right before, when we said that the Shochet was suspended in midair, it was Dafka Shmuel who was Mekil. Just one second. Shmuel was Machmir, and Avud Shmuel was the one who said no, that the Shochet himself doesn't have to be grounded. But in the case of Kabbalah Saddam, that was the case of Shechita. But in Kabbalah, Omalesh Tabasht, Avud Shmuel points out to Shmuel, his son, that he made a mistake. Ain't derech sheres bekach. The avoda of Kabbalah, which is a full-fledged avoda, and he's doing it while he's suspended in midair. I don't know exactly. They're holding on to him from with ropes or something. I don't know what. He's doing some air gliding. That is lo kederech sheres. That's not the normal way that you serve, and therefore it's possible. So once again, just to summarize, Avud de Shmuel was mekil for shchita if the shochet is suspended in meir, but he's machmir with regard to Kabbalah. And once again, we come back to the same yisod that we mentioned over and over again, that we're more lenient in shchita than in Kabbalah because shchita is kshera bizar. Next question. Tola v'kibel mahu. What if the animal is suspended in midair at the time of the Kabbalah Saddam? Now, if we go back to the original statement of Avud de Shmuel, in the case where the animal was suspended and he did shchita, and Avud de Shmuel says it's possible because in Kodshe Kodshim you need yerech. So here also, if the Kabbalah was when the animal was suspended in midair, once again, I would say that it's like the shchita and there's no al yerech and omelo psul, and therefore Shmuel responds that it's possible, which is intuitively correct. Omelesh Tabashi made a mistake. Shchita al yerech v'lo kabbalah al yerech. The Torah only requires yerech with regard to the shchita, but not with regard to kabbalah. He says here in the name of Rashi, nowhere does the Torah mention the stipulation of yerech with regard to kabbalah. Omar Abaye apparently disagrees with Avud Shmuel. B'kodshei kodshim kulon psulos. In all cases, barring one, if we're talking about kodshim kodshim, it's possible. Meaning the requirement of number one, safon, and number two, yerech, are very strict with regard to kodshei kodshim, and therefore we're going to invalidate the carbon if the animal is suspended in midair. And apparently, if I understand correctly, Abai is applying this even to the qualification of yerech with regard to Kabbalah. Barmi nitla v'shachat. So again, if the Kohen did the shechita when he himself was suspended, then the carbon is kosher. But not with regard to Kabbalah. B'kodshim kalim kulam ksheros bar mi nitla v'kibel. Right, nitla v'kibel means that if he was suspended in air and he did the Kabbalah, that's not derech sherus. And that psul of shalot kederech sherus applies to kodshei kalim to the same extent that it applies to kodshei kodshim. Omar Rav doesn't like this. Ma'ishna tola v'kibel b'kodshim kalim v'kshera. You're telling me, Abaye, that even if the animal is suspended in midair at the time of the Kabbalah Saddam in Kodshim Kalim, nevertheless it's kosher. Now in Kodshim Kalim, we're not dealing with Yerach for sure. We're not even dealing with Safon. We're dealing with the Azor itself. And according to Abaye in Kodshim Kalim, we're going to say that the Avir of the Azara is like the Azara itself. And that's called the Avir Pnim Kifnim Dami. That the airspace inside the Azara is called inside the Azara. Is then B'kodshim Kalim Nami, Avir Tzafon Kitzafon Dami. You should apply the same yardstick in Kodshim with regard to the Tzafon. Right? Azara to Kodshim Kalim is equal to Safon in Kodshei Kodshim. So if you're telling me that Avir Azara Kazara Dami, then Avir Safon Kitzafon Dami, why do you, Abai, say that if the animal was suspended at the time of the animal that is Kodshei Kodshim was suspended at the time of the Kabbalah, it's possible, and that's what Abai said. Because kodshim kulam psulos, why should it be possible? Why not apply the principle of avir tzafon kitzafon domi? Elam arava bein kodshim kalim ksheros. In other words, in all cases, the carbon is kosher except for one. Bar min tola v'shachat v'kodshei kodshim. If the animal was suspended in midair in kodshei kodshim at the time of the shechita, then it's possible. So that's a psul in shechita. So here we see that Rav is being more machmer in shechita, which is against everything we said until now. But nitla v'kibel, if it's only Kabbalah and the animal is up in the air, suspended at the time of the Kabbalah, bein b'kodshei kodshim, bein b'kodshei kalim ksheira. Just 1 second. No, it doesn't say ksheira. Just 1 second, sorry. Nitla v'kibel ben kachim kalim. I guess it means puzzle then. Let me just see if I got this one. So again, with regard to the animal being suspended at the time of the shechita, we're more machmir, says Rav, in kachim than in kachim kalam. But with regard to the animal being suspended at the time of Kabbalah, then we're going to be machmir, we're going to pass the carbon whether or not it's kachim or kachim kalam. So again, Rav is applying our principle that we're more machmir in Kabbalah Saddam. So he has a short summary here. He says that if the carbon is suspended, so then it'll be invalid if the shechita is a shechita of kachim, where the Torah requires yerech. However, the shechita of kachim kalim, where the Torah does not require yerech, is kosher. Kabbalah is kosher because the Torah never said, with regard to Kabbalah, that there's a psul of if the animal is suspended. Right, and again, even though if the animal is suspended, it's not called yerech, but there's no requirement of yerech during Kabbalah. The requirement of yerech is only during shechita. And we're going to differentiate between Kochim Kalim and Kochim Kochim because Kochim Kalim never require Yerech, and therefore, if the animal is suspended in Kochim Kalim, then it's kosher. And as we said before, there's even in Kochim Kochim, the requirement of Yerech doesn't apply to Kabbalah. You'll ask me, but wait a minute, forget about Yerech, but certainly you need Safon, and the requirement of Safon applies to Kabbalah as well. The answer is that the airspace over the Tzafon is considered like the Tzafon. Now that's all if the animal was suspended. If the Kohen himself was suspended, then in all cases the Kabbalah is possible because it's not derech sherus. Shchit, however, will always be kosher because that's not considered an avodos, it's ksher v'zar. So even in kodshei kodshim, which require yerech, it doesn't matter. Yerech is only a requirement in the animal, but not in the Kohen. And we don't care whether the Kohen who does the shechita is yerech, is alongside of his be'ech, or he's not. Boy, minei Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Rab Zera, hu b'fnim v'tzitzo b'chutz mahu. Apparently, tzitzo means the hair. Tzitzo is any like fringes, like of the tzitz talis. Here it means the hair of the Kohen. So the Kohen himself is inside the Azara, but his hair is outside the Azara. Ma, what's the law? Amalei, and Rav Zeh is going to say it's possible. Even the hair has to be inside the Azara. Lav Amrit doesn't say ve'vi lashem ad shetava kulo b'fnim. Hachinami bevoim el ol moed ad sheyavel kulo li ol moed. That just like with regard to the carbon itself has to be kulo, has to be completely inside the azar, so too the Kohen has to be totally inside the azar. And if his hair is outside the azara, that's not enough. And this leads us to the Mishnah. So now on the bottom of Chav Vav, Nisano al Gabi Akevsh. Now here's a whole list of cases where the carbon is possible. But the strange thing about these cases is that even though the carbon is possible, Nevertheless, if the basar was eaten, you're not chayiv kares. So what are these cases? Nesaru al gabi hakevish. Instead of placing the dam on the mizbeach, he placed it on the ramp leading up to the mizbeach, which to some extent has the same status as the mizbeach. Shalo keneged yisod. The zrikos have to be on any of 3 out of 4 of the sides of the mizbeach, but not on the southeast. Right? Why? Because the yisod, which was an amma of a step in the foundation, plus, right, it was an amma high and it was an amma wide, and it circled as the base of the mizbeach on all sides except for the southeastern side. So the zrikas hadam on the mizbeach could be done on 3 out of 4 of the sides, but not on the southeast. It's always got to be opposite the base. Now, the mizbeach had in the middle what's called a chut hasikra. It had a red string that separated the lamala from the lamata. And most karbanos require zrika lamata. But there are a few karbanos, which are mostly special chatos, that require zrika lamala. So what happened now? Nasan es nisan lamata lamala, es hanisanim lamala lamata, es hanisanim. So if he messed up and he, instead of doing the zrika on the top or on the bottom as he was, that also will passel the carbon. And then there are certain karbanos where the zrika has to be done inside the heichal. Almost all the karbanos require zrika on the mizbeach hachitza, on the mizbeach hanechoshes outside the heichal. But there are a few karbanos that require that the dam go inside the heichal, meaning on the mizbeach hapnimi, the mizbeach hasav. And if he messed up in any of these 2 directions, possible. So in all the above cases, the carbon is possible. But says the Mishnah, the ein bo kares, which means that if he eats of the basar, then there's no chiyuv kares. And the Gemara later on Daf Chav Zayin is going to explain why there was a havamina to say that he is chayiv kares, but mashmal he's not chayiv kares. Now, amongst the karbonos that require that the dam be applied on the inside of the heichel, that mizbeach, we have par helim davar shel tzibur, we have par kohen gadol. Now it's interesting. Par kohen gadol has its own halachos. You need hazoya on the parochas. Fine. Okay, this is okay. Now we start the sugyas ha-gemara.